What if I told you the most powerful voice in the room didn't shout to be heard? What if strength looked like silence before it became a storm? This is the story of Zora Matthews, a girl from the forgotten corners of Flint, Michigan, who steps into the high-stakes world of national debate and leaves the entire room speechless. Not with volume, but with precision, with presence, with the kind of truth you can't ignore. Before the judges were ready, before the elite were watching, she was already sharpening her voice. If you're ready for a story that will stir your mind and stay with your heart, one that challenges who gets to speak and who gets to win, keep listening. But first, take a second to like this video, and if you're new here, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this, stories that matter. And when the final word lands, let us know in the comments, what's the sharpest voice you've ever heard? Or better yet, who's still waiting to find theirs? Now, let the story begin. In the heart of Flint, Michigan, a city often overlooked and underestimated, a quiet storm begins to rise. Zora Matthews, a determined and deeply observant black girl from a humble family, steps into the charged world of high school debate. With nothing but grit, intellect, and an unshakable sense of self, she takes on competitors from the nation's most elite schools. But Zora isn't just here to win arguments, she's here to rewrite the rules of who gets to be heard. The Sharpest Voice in the Room is a story about the power of restraint, the force of quiet confidence, and what happens when someone from the margins steps into the spotlight and commands it without ever raising her voice. Through doubt, pressure, and the weight of expectations, Zora rises, not by being the loudest but by being undeniable. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, painting streaks of gold on the faded wallpaper. The smell of frying eggs and old radiator heat filled the small kitchen. Zora Matthews sat at the wobbly dining table, hunched over a thick paperback copy of The Souls of Black Folk, her pencil dancing in the margins. She barely noticed the sizzling pan or the soft hum of a gospel song playing low from the old radio by the sink. Her mind was elsewhere, always elsewhere, chasing ideas, arguments, meaning. "Zora," her mother called from the stove, flipping eggs with practiced ease. "You've been up since dawn again. That book must be something else." Zora looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Her mother, tall and soft-spoken, wore tired eyes behind glasses that had long since needed replacing. She moved with grace, even when exhausted. "I like the way he writes," Zora said. "It feels like he's fighting without raising his voice." Her mother paused, then chuckled. "That's the kind of fighter you'd be, baby. The kind who lets her words do the swinging." Zora returned her gaze to the page, letting the compliment settle into her chest like warmth from the heater. Outside, the city of Flint was waking up in its own stubborn way. Cold spring winds scraped through narrow streets and past sagging porches. Old trucks coughed awake. Water pipes creaked and moaned in protest. The city bore its wounds in silence. Wounds from poisoned water, shuttered factories, and long-forgotten promises. Zora rode the city bus to Lincoln High School, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds playing a podcast about the Constitution. She was the kind of student who corrected history teachers when they rushed through Reconstruction. The kind who filled composition notebooks with essays no one had assigned. She wasn't popular, but she was known. Quiet, sharp, unshaken. A girl who always seemed to be thinking 3 steps ahead. Lincoln High was like many public schools trying to stand tall despite crumbling paint and underfunded programs. The loudspeakers buzzed with announcements, lockers clanged shut like doors in a factory, and hallways smelled like cafeteria pizza and pencil shavings. Zora navigated it all like a shadow, unnoticed until she spoke, and when she spoke, people tended to listen. It was during third-period English that everything shifted. Miss Carter, a fierce, cardigan-wearing woman with a love for Baldwin and a stare that could quiet an entire class, had just posed a question about justice and the law. The usual hands shot up. Zora did not raise hers. But when a boy in the back offered a shallow answer and Miss Carter's eyes flicked over to her, Zora spoke without waiting. "Justice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by who holds power. If laws are written without us, they're written against us." The room fell still. Miss Carter blinked slowly, then smiled. "Zora Matthews," she said, "have you ever thought about joining the debate team?" Zora blinked back. "No," she said honestly. "Well," Miss Carter said, scribbling something into her notebook, "you're about to." That afternoon, Zora found herself sitting in a cluttered classroom with 4 other students and a debate coach who taught math by day and led practices with a thermos of stale coffee in hand. The team didn't have matching jackets or trophies. They barely had enough budget for transportation to local competitions. But Zora saw something there. A chance. a room where her voice might matter. And so, without much fanfare, she joined. At home, she didn't tell her mother right away. It wasn't that she wanted to keep it a secret, it just didn't seem real yet. Instead, she pored over old debate recordings on YouTube, learning how to turn logic into art, how to press a point like a scalpel to a wound. She practiced speeches in her room, standing in front of the mirror, watching her reflection for every flinch, every tremble. "You are not here to perform," she whispered to herself one night. "You are here to prove that silence is not the same as absence." In the coming weeks, Zora would step into her first competition wearing a borrowed blazer and carrying the hopes of a school that rarely made it past round one. She didn't know yet how far it would take her, or who she would face. But already, something had begun to stir inside her, a sense that she could shape the air with her words, that she could be heard, that she could win. And in Flint, where voices were often lost in the noise of survival, that was no small thing. The first debate tournament of the season was held at a high school across town, in a building that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and privilege. Zora sat quietly in the back of the school van, her fingers wrapped tightly around a folder filled with arguments, rebuttals, and counterpoints. Her team rode in silence, half from nerves, half from knowing this was a long shot. Coach Weaver, a man who always wore corduroy pants and the same faded tie with a math equation printed on it, turned around in his seat as they pulled into the school lot. "Remember," he said, his voice low and even, "speak clearly, stay calm, and don't let them rush you. Your logic is your shield. Your tone is your sword." The others nodded. Zora just breathed. Inside, the air was electric with teenage tension. Schools with long reputations and bigger budgets had shown up in force. Students in tailored blazers moved through the hallways like they were born for the courtroom. Their coaches adjusted ties, passed out highlighters, and whispered last-minute advice. Lincoln High stood out, clothing mismatched, folders dog-eared, confidence quieter. Zora's first round was against a team from East Grand Rapids. Their lead speaker was a girl with pin-straight blonde hair and a voice like polished steel. Her arguments were tight, her tone condescending. She barely glanced at Zora as she delivered her points, assuming, perhaps, that this was a warm-up round. Zora rose when it was her turn to speak. Her voice, soft at first, grew sharper with every sentence. She didn't match the other girl's aggression, she didn't need to. Instead, she dismantled arguments with quiet precision, pointing out logical gaps and offering deeper evidence pulled from late-night research sessions. By the time she finished, the room was silent. When the results were posted, Lincoln had won the round. Zora blinked at the paper, as if unsure she was reading it correctly. Her teammates clapped her on the back. Coach Weaver gave her a single nod, approval in his eyes. That day they advanced through 2 more rounds, upsetting schools no one thought they could beat. Afterward, while waiting for the van, Zora leaned against the brick wall of the school, her breath curling in the cold air. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Carter. "Heard about your win." You shook the room, Zora. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. Zora didn't smile, but something in her eyes lit up. Something quiet. Something growing. As the weeks passed, the tournaments came one after another. Zora's skill sharpened with every debate. She began anticipating arguments before they were made, sidestepping traps, weaving emotion into logic. She wasn't just reciting facts, she was building cases that felt like stories. And the other team started to notice. Some underestimated her until it was too late. Others watched her warily, whispering in hallways, calling her the Flint girl, with a mix of awe and resentment. A few tried to mimic her calm tone, her precise phrasing. But none could do it the way she did. Because Zora wasn't performing. She was remembering. Remembering the long nights her mother worked double shifts, how Malik once cried from the taste of bottled water that had gone bad, how neighbors had marched for justice and been met with silence. She carried their stories into every round. By the time the state championship arrived, Lincoln High was no longer an afterthought. They had made it to the final bracket, and their opponent was the team everyone had expected to win from the start, Fairmont Academy. Zora read the name on the schedule and felt her breath catch. Fairmont was a legend. The school boasted generations of debaters who had gone on to Ivy League schools, law degrees, and politics. Their team arrived with blazers that bore crests, rolling suitcases of documents, and coaches who treated the tournament like a courtroom trial. Zora stood across from them in a quiet classroom that would host their semi-final round. The Fairmont team smirked as she took her seat. Their lead debater, a tall boy named Bryce, leaned over and whispered something to his teammate, just loud enough for Zora to hear. "This won't take long." She didn't respond. The judge entered. The clock started. and the room fell into the rhythm of war made of words. Fairmont's opening was flawless, polished, fast, filled with references to federal policy and neatly packaged statistics. But Zora didn't flinch. She waited, watched, and wrote. When it was her turn, she rose slowly, her voice even. "Facts without context are weapons without aim," she said. "Allow me to add the missing context." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. But with every sentence, she peeled away at the arrogance of their argument, exposing assumptions, correcting distortions, grounding everything in both law and lived reality. By the time she reached her closing, Bryce looked rattled. She sat down, calm as ever. When the judge announced Lincoln's victory, the Fairmont team looked stunned. Bryce muttered something under his breath and walked out without shaking hands. But Zora didn't care. The final round was next, and for the first time she could feel it, truly feel it. She was on her way. Detroit pulsed with history. You could feel it in the bones of the city, the cracked sidewalks, the murals on brick walls, the music that floated up from parked cars and corner stores. It was a city that had fought, burned, rebuilt, and dared to sing again. Zora Matthews stepped off the bus into that air, her team trailing behind her. Her blazer, borrowed from Miss Carter's closet, still didn't quite fit at the shoulders. But she carried herself as though it had been tailored just for her. As though she belonged anywhere she walked. The national championship was being held at a university campus downtown, all glass buildings and banners flapping in the cold spring wind. Schools from across the country had come, names Zora had only seen on podiums and press releases. Some teams were greeted like celebrities, their coaches handing out branded folders and notebooks. Lincoln High arrived with one duffel bag of supplies and a folder held together with tape. They registered quietly. Zora scanned the room, taking in the chatter, the gleaming shoes, the confidence that came from money and expectation. Coach Weaver handed out the final tournament brackets. "Top 16, he said, glancing at the sheet. "We're ranked 13th. That means our first round is against, yes, again, Fairmont." A silence fell over the team. "They want a rematch," Coach Weaver added. "Seems they filed a protest after the state loss. Didn't go through, obviously. But now we face them again. National stage this time." Zora stared at the bracket. "Good," she said. The room where they would debate was an auditorium, not a classroom. A wide semicircle of chairs faced the center stage where the teams would stand. 3 judges waited at a long table, legal pads in front of them, pens poised. They introduced themselves with titles and accolades. Zora memorized none of them. Across the room, Bryce was already waiting, a smug smile on his face. His team had changed into new blazers, the school crest gleaming gold. As Zora and her teammate walked to their spot, Bryce leaned just a little closer. "This time," he said softly, "you won't be catching anyone off guard." Zora didn't reply. She never did. The moderator gave the topic, the impact of criminal justice reform on public safety, and the clock began. Fairmont went first. Their presentation was smooth, rehearsed, gliding through data points and precedent with the ease of those who had been taught by private tutors and summer institutes. Then it was Zora's turn. She stepped forward, notebook in hand, and looked at the judges. "My opponent speaks of reform as a policy," she began, "but in my city, it is survival." She talked about Flint, about over-policing, about neighbors who had been detained without due process. She quoted legal scholars but also referenced her uncle, who had spent years navigating a parole system built to fail. Her logic was clean, her structure impeccable. But it was the weight in her voice, the knowing, that pulled the room in. Bryce tried to interrupt her during rebuttal. She held up her hand and spoke over him, calm and clear, cutting through his interjection with nothing more than a sentence that landed like a verdict. By the time the round ended, the auditorium had gone still. The judges thanked both teams. The competitors shook hands. Bryce's grip was stiff. His smile had vanished. Outside, the hallway buzzed with other teams preparing for their matches, but Zora stood still, breathing in the air. She had found her rhythm now, her cadence. She no longer needed to rehearse the words. They came naturally, like a tide rising to meet the shore. 2 more rounds passed that day. Both were victories. One judge called her closing statement the most measured and impactful they had seen in 5 years. Another simply said, "That girl speaks like she's already in the courtroom." When the finalists were announced, Lincoln High was on the list. Zora sat beside Coach Weaver and her teammates in the long hallway before the final round. The campus outside had grown quiet, the sun dipping low behind glass towers. She thought of her mother back home, likely just finishing another shift, her feet aching, wondering if Zora had eaten anything. She thought of Malik, who always asked if her debates were like battles, and if so, whether she had won her wars. Coach Weaver reached into his pocket and handed her a note. "I forgot," he said. "Miss Carter sent this with me." Zora unfolded the small paper. "No matter how high the stage, your voice will rise higher. Keep speaking. Keep striking. You were never meant to whisper." She closed the note and tucked it into her blazer's inner pocket. The final debate would begin soon. Her opponents would be the reigning champions from Massachusetts, a team that had never placed lower than second. They were already on the stage, setting up microphones and arranging their arguments. But Zora wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about Flint. About every cracked sidewalk and empty promise and book she had read with a flashlight because the power bill hadn't been paid yet. About the way her mother had once told her, "You have the kind of mind that doesn't just break through walls. It makes people question why the walls were there in the first place." And tonight, she would speak as though every word could tear one more wall down. The stage lights were brighter than Zora expected. They didn't flicker or hum, but they cast a clean, steady heat that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. The auditorium had filled slowly with coaches, students, and judges from every corner of the competition. Even teams that had already been eliminated came to watch. Because this was the final round. Because word had spread. Because they all wanted to see if the girl from Flint would really take the title. Zora stood on one side of the stage, her teammate beside her. Their folders were open but not cluttered, their notes written in small, careful script. Across from them, the Massachusetts team wore sleek suits and held printed cards. Their coach sat in the front row, murmuring instructions as if he could will the win into their hands. The moderator walked to the center mic. "Final resolution," she said. "This house believes that economic inequality is the greatest threat to American democracy." Zora's heart stilled for a moment. It was a topic she had read about for years, not because of debate prep, but because it was her life. It was the question behind every corner store closing, every empty house, every hour her mother worked past exhaustion. The Massachusetts team opened with polished urgency. They spoke of macroeconomic patterns, graphs, federal tax data, and voter suppression linked to campaign financing. They moved like clockwork, handing off to each other without pause, their sentences bouncing in carefully timed sync. It was technically perfect, but not human. When it was Zora's turn, she stepped forward and spoke into the silence. "My opponents speak of inequality in numbers. I will speak of it in names." And then she told them about the house down her street where 3 families lived under one roof, sharing a single kitchen and dreams they had to shrink just to fit. She spoke about the library that closed on weekends, the school books printed before she was born, and the water lines that still ran poison through parts of her city. "This is not theoretical," she said. "This is policy turned into pain." She backed every story with research, every example with evidence. But it was the weight behind her words, the sense that this was not a topic she had studied, but a truth she had lived, that made the room still. Her teammate followed seamlessly, reinforcing their side with legal frameworks, showing how inequality didn't just bend democracy, it crushed it. The Massachusetts team tried to regain control. They doubled down on statistics. They cited think tanks and economists and the usual parade of names. Zora returned to the mic for her closing. "Injustice doesn't begin when the Constitution is ignored," she said. "It begins when it is written for only some to understand and fewer to benefit from." Her voice never rose, but it resonated. When the round ended, there was no applause, not yet. The judges stood and left the room, taking the tension with them. Zora walked back to her seat. Her fingers were cold, her breathing even. Coach Weaver didn't say anything, just gave her a nod. Her teammates looked at her like they had already won. But she didn't feel like a victor. Not yet. The wait was long. People whispered. Other students exchanged predictions. One of the eliminated competitors from Ohio leaned over and whispered to her teammate, "She's the best speaker I've seen." No question. When the judges returned, the moderator held a small envelope in her hand. She smiled, and for a moment, Zora felt the room pressing closer. After careful deliberation, the moderator said, "We are pleased to announce that the national debate champions are Lincoln High School." The room erupted. The shock, the joy, the disbelief all hit at once. Zora stood frozen. Her teammates hugged, shouting and laughing. Coach Weaver looked like he might sit down just to stop himself from falling over. Zora stepped forward to shake the hands of the Massachusetts team. Their captain met her eyes and nodded, stiffly but with the respect that only defeat can teach. A judge came to her with a small plaque. "Best speaker," she said quietly, placing it in Zora's hand. "You made people feel something." And that's the hardest thing to teach. Zora nodded, lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't trust herself to speak. Not yet. When she stepped off the stage, her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. I watched the live stream. Malik's crying. I think I am too. You did it, baby. You did it. Zora closed her eyes, letting the weight of it settle on her shoulders. The victory, the journey, the impossibility now made real. In a city where voices were too often ignored, hers had risen like a flare. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had simply spoken. And the nation had listened. The sun over Detroit the next morning broke through a curtain of gray clouds, catching on rooftops, scattering gold across brick and glass. Zora stood near the hotel window, her hands wrapped around a cup of cheap hotel coffee that steamed into her face like fog. She hadn't slept much. Not because of nerves or excitement, but because something had shifted, something hard to name. The win was real. The plaque still sat on the desk. Her team's name was already trending on social media. But beneath all that noise, Zora felt something deeper. Not pride. Responsibility. Coach Weaver drove them home in the same rickety van. No fanfare. No music. Just tired laughter, the occasional outburst of disbelief. Did you see Bryce's face when they called our name? And Zora leaning her head against the window, watching the towns flicker past. Flint didn't change while she was gone. The roads were still cracked. The corner store still had 2 broken lights above the entrance. Her house still creaked when the wind hit just right. But something in her had changed. When she stepped through the front door, Malik ran up and grabbed her around the waist, nearly knocking the plaque out of her hands. You beat them, he shouted. You beat all of them. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her uniform from the hospital. Her eyes were glassy, but her smile was soft and proud. They're talking about you on the radio, she said. On the internet too. One of my patients called you a rising voice in the next generation. I told her, she's been that. Y'all just finally heard her. Zora sat on the couch, the weight of the day melting into the couch cushions. Malik curled up beside her. The house smelled like burnt rice and old candles. The kind of comfort no trophy could replace. That night, she pulled out her journal, the one she never let anyone see, and wrote her name on the first page right at the top. Underneath, she scribbled a new sentence. Let them remember what it sounds like when the overlooked speak clearly. By the end of the week, emails flooded in. Local papers asked for interviews. A small legal nonprofit offered her a summer fellowship. Colleges that had once skimmed her application now reached out with questions, invitations, and calls from admissions staff who sounded far too surprised. The school board held a small assembly. There were cupcakes, folding chairs, and a microphone that screeched every few minutes. The mayor sent a certificate that spelled her name wrong, but Miss Carter fixed it before Zora could see. Still, the best moment came quietly in the hallway near the science wing. A girl from the freshman class, hair tied up in a puff, stopped Zora as she passed. You're Zora, right? She asked, barely above a whisper. Zora nodded. My brother, he said you won that big thing, the girl said. He said you made the smart kids look dumb. Zora raised an eyebrow. I made them listen. The girl grinned. Same difference. She walked away before Zora could say more. But that moment stayed with her. The season was over. Lincoln High's debate team went from underdogs to legends. Coach Weaver started making plans for next year. Miss Carter added new books to the classroom shelves, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, bell hooks, all marked with sticky notes that read for the next Zora. But Zora wasn't done. She began speaking at community events. Not fancy speeches, just conversations. She told students how she had learned to argue without shouting, to win without humiliating, to stand without shaking. She started teaching Malik how to hold his own in a disagreement. He was 7 and already had the tone of a future councilman. And at night, when the house went quiet, Zora still wrote. Not just arguments, but reflections. Memories. Truths she wasn't ready to say aloud. Her voice was sharpening in new ways. One evening, she found herself at the edge of the Flint River, standing beneath the bridge where protest signs still clung to the railings. The water moved slow and thick, the smell still sour, the trust still broken. She thought about the people who never got justice. The names that went unspoken. The stories buried beneath policies and silence. She took out her phone and hit record. This is Zora Matthews, she said, her voice steady, wind cutting across the mic, and I'm here to remind you voices rise. Even in places where they were told to hush. Especially there. She ended the recording and stared at the river a long time. Not because it gave answers, but because it carried history. Just like her. Spring in Flint always came in bursts, sunlight one day, sleet the next. The air was unpredictable and so was everything else. But in Zora's world, unpredictability no longer meant chaos. It meant movement. It meant change. She began her mornings with books and case law. She spent her afternoons with Miss Carter, practicing advanced argumentation far beyond what high school required. On weekends, she led workshops at the public library. Students came from across the city, kids who had never debated before, kids who didn't know what a rebuttal was but had mastered the art of holding a room's attention with their stories. Zora didn't teach them how to imitate. She taught them how to own. "You don't have to sound like anyone but yourself," she told a boy who stuttered through his opening. "You don't have to prove you belong. You just have to show them you never left." Word spread fast. The workshops filled quickly. One of the city council members stopped by and watched an entire session from the back of the room, arms folded, nodding slowly. "You could run for office someday," she said afterward. Zora shook her head. "Not yet. I've got too many questions. Politicians stop asking them." The councilwoman smiled. "Maybe. But you've got the kind of voice that builds a crowd around the truth." Zora shrugged, but deep down she felt it too, the sense that every word she spoke was beginning to carry farther. Meanwhile, her mother quietly filled out scholarship paperwork in the evenings, circling deadlines on the calendar. Malik kept a tally of every school that emailed Zora back, drawing stars beside the names that had libraries bigger than their neighborhood block. She was no longer just applying for college. She was choosing. One night, she sat with Coach Weaver after a school event and asked, "Do you ever think they expected this?" He chuckled. "They didn't even imagine this." Then his expression turned thoughtful. "But that's the thing, Zora. When the world doesn't imagine you, that's your advantage. You get to walk into every room unexpected. And you get to rewrite the story they were sure they already knew." Zora nodded, watching the janitor sweep up confetti near the stage. "Feels like a lot," she admitted. "It is a lot," he replied. "That's how you know it matters." As summer neared, the interviews came faster. A documentary crew reached out. A podcast wanted her to co-host a series on youth activism. She said no to most of it, not out of fear, but out of focus. She knew she wasn't done building. Her next steps needed to be chosen, not offered. The fire that had driven her through the national stage wasn't meant to flicker under attention. It was meant to grow. She walked through downtown Flint often, past boarded buildings and murals of revolutionaries and artists. She'd stop sometimes and speak softly to the air, not for anyone else to hear, but to remind herself that speaking and being heard were not the same thing, and she needed to do both. She started writing more, a collection of essays that blended debate with memory. She called them Arguments from the Broken Sidewalk, and one day she let Miss Carter read them. By the next morning, her essays had been forwarded to a university press editor in Ann Arbor. A meeting was scheduled. A train ticket was bought. Zora made the trip alone. When she sat across the table from the editor, an older woman with ink-stained fingers and a sharp gaze, the first thing she said was, "You write like someone who's already been underestimated. And you argue like someone who doesn't plan on letting that happen again." Zora smiled. "Exactly." That summer, Zora got her first official acceptance letter from a university with an offer she hadn't dared hope for. Full ride, pre-law track, housing, books, mentorship. It wasn't just an opportunity. It was proof that Flint didn't have to be a footnote. That a voice sharpened by silence could echo through halls lined with portraits of people who had never once imagined her face among them. When she read the letter out loud at dinner, Malik hooped so loud the neighbors came knocking. Her mother wiped her eyes and said, "We'll help you pack. Just tell us when." Zora looked around their tiny kitchen. The scuffed table, the broken clock, the corner where she used to read aloud to Malik during brownouts. "I'm not leaving anything behind," she said. "I'm just taking it with me." The first day of college didn't feel like a beginning. Felt like a test. Zora stepped onto the campus of Briarhurst University with a worn leather backpack, a tight braid down her spine, and a silence so deliberate it became its own kind of strength. The building stretched high and wide, limestone giants with ivy climbing up their spines like secrets. The courtyard was buzzing with students who already spoke the language of belonging. Laughter in shorthand. Familiarity passed back and forth like a shared note. But Zora didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that presence is not about noise. It's about weight. She found her dorm easily, unpacked without help, and pinned a photo of Malik and her mother to the corkboard above her desk. The room still smelled like dust and detergent, but she opened the window and let the Michigan air roll in, part lake breeze, part city memory. The first lecture hall was colder than she expected, a cavern of quiet hums and metal chairs. The professor spoke with a clipped accent and referenced case law like it was common knowledge. Students scribbled frantically. Zora listened, not to the words but to the gaps between them. And when the professor paused to pose a question, open-ended, thorny, designed to corner, no one raised their hand. Except Zora. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't preface or soften her voice. She simply answered. Clarity. Precision. Control. When she finished, the professor blinked once. Nodded. Very well, he said. It wasn't praise, but it was recognition. And that was enough. In debate club it was harder. The other members were sharp. Some were legacy students. Others came from prep academies where they trained like athletes. Their confidence wasn't loud, it was structural. Woven into their posture, their word choices, the way they didn't need to prove anything. They didn't underestimate her openly, but Zora knew how to read between lines. The first few weeks she didn't speak much. She watched, learned their patterns, listened for the rhythm beneath their rhetoric. When she did enter a round, she started slow, calm, measured, deliberate. She didn't win every time, but when she lost, she studied. When she won, she rewrote. And one night, in a heated internal scrimmage, she dismantled the club president's arguments so thoroughly, without raising her voice, without even standing, that the room went still. He offered a handshake after. I didn't see that coming, he admitted. You never do, Zora replied. Outside of class and debate, her life unfolded quietly. She worked in the campus writing center. She led late-night study sessions in the library for students who felt out of place. She wrote her essays from her dorm window, looking out at the shadows of buildings that once looked unreachable. And she never forgot Flint. She called home every Sunday. Malik gave her updates in breathless run-ons. Her mother kept the calls short but steady, her voice tired and proud. She visited the high school over winter break. Lincoln's debate room was smaller than she remembered. The chairs were mismatched. The paint was still peeling. But the team was larger now, and louder. Miss Carter brought her in as a guest speaker. They called her Coach Zora. She laughed, but inside something clicked. She watched a sophomore girl named Jayla take the floor, nervous, unsure, fumbling the start of her opening. But when she locked eyes with Zora near the door, she straightened, found her voice, and finished strong. By her second year at Briarhist, Zora had a reputation. Professors knew her name. Organizations invited her to speak. She was published in a national journal on civic discourse. She earned her spot on the university's top debate team and traveled the country, New York, Seattle, D.C., arguing on stages that once felt like fiction. But no matter the venue, she stayed the same. Still the girl who learned to speak in silence. Still the voice shaped by Flint's cracks and resilience. Still the storm that no one saw coming. At the National Invitational during her sophomore spring, the room was packed again. Another final round. Another resolution. Another elite team across the floor, their arguments practiced, polished, predictable. And Zora? She stepped to the mic, quiet as snowfall. And then she spoke. Slow, clear, relentless. She didn't argue like someone trying to win. She argued like someone who had already decided that truth mattered more than victory. By the end, the opposing team wasn't just quiet. They were listening. And when the final score was announced, it wasn't the standing ovation that marked the moment. It was the silence right before. The hush of awe. Of knowing you'd just witnessed something that would be remembered. Zora Matthews became more than a competitor. She became a standard. In Flint, her story was told in classrooms and barbershops, on murals and flyers. In lecture halls, her essays were cited as models of rhetorical power. But through it all, she remained grounded. Writing, teaching, building. Because she understood something few ever do. That the sharpest voice in the room is not always the loudest. It is the one that cuts through doubt and carves space for others to rise. The end. Here are 7 moral lessons that can be drawn from the sharpest voice in the room. 1. Never let your origin define your ceiling. Zora came from a place often dismissed, Flint, Michigan. A city that had been spoken of more for its struggles than for its potential. She didn't come from a legacy family, didn't attend an elite prep school, and didn't wear privilege like a second skin. But she understood this truth. Beginnings are not borders. Where you come from may explain your path, but it never excuses your limits. Her rise wasn't in spite of her roots, it was because she let them anchor her as she climbed. Flint didn't hold her back. It gave her clarity. It gave her purpose. And that grounded strength became her compass, even in the most unfamiliar rooms. 2. Underestimation can be a weapon, if you know how to wield it. Time and time again, Zora was underestimated. By her opponents, by institutions, sometimes even by those within her own orbit. But instead of shrinking beneath their lowered expectations, she used them as cover. While others relaxed, she prepared. While they presumed, she studied. She dismantled arguments from the inside, not by being louder, but by being sharper. The lesson is clear. Underestimation can either be a cage or a cloak. When you understand your power, invisibility becomes a strategy, not a sentence. 3. Intelligence is power, but composure is mastery. Zora was brilliant, yes, but it was her control that disarmed opponents. In debate, she never raised her voice. She didn't belittle or bait. She composed herself like a poet at war, deliberate, incisive, and calm. Because rage can spark change, but reason sustains it. In a world that often rewards noise, Zora taught that stillness is not weakness. Composure doesn't mean passivity, it means choosing your timing, knowing when to strike, and refusing to let chaos dictate your brilliance. For silence is not the absence of voice, it's the space before thunder. For much of her early life, Zora wasn't the loudest in the room. She wasn't the first to speak. She watched. She listened. And in doing so, she learned. When she finally spoke, her words carried more than opinion. They carried observation, restraint, and truth. The world often mistakes silence for absence. But sometimes, silence is the rehearsal of revolution. Zora taught that your voice doesn't need to echo every moment. It only needs to arrive at the right one, and when it does, let it land like thunder. 5. Representation isn't just a symbol. It's a strategy. Zora's win didn't just belong to her. It belonged to every student in Flint who had never seen themselves at the top of a national stage. It belonged to Malik, to Miss Carter, to every girl who was told she was too soft-spoken, too dark-skinned, too working-class to be powerful. Zora's presence created permission. She proved that representation is not a trophy, it's a tool. Because when one of us makes it, the rest of us stop asking if we can and start asking how. 6. Education isn't a ladder, it's a bridge. Throughout the story, Zora didn't hoard knowledge. She shared it, taught workshops, mentored younger students, returned to her old high school not as a guest but as a guide. She understood that education is not about escaping where you're from. It's about connecting where you've been to where you're going, and inviting others to walk that path beside you. True learning doesn't isolate. It builds bridges. It makes knowledge contagious. 7. The sharpest voice isn't the loudest, it's the most intentional. Finally, Zora's journey proves the power of intentionality. Every argument she made, every decision, every return trip to Flint, every essay, it was all chosen. Not reactive, not impulsive, intentional. In a world where everyone is rushing to be heard, Zora slowed down to be understood. She didn't just speak truth, she shaped it. And in doing so, she carved a place in rooms that were never built for her voice. The lesson? Power doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes, it walks in on quiet feet and changes everything. Together, these 7 lessons form the heart of the sharpest voice in the room. They are not just morals for the story's world. They are a map for anyone navigating a world that doubts them, silences them, or forgets them. Disclaimer. The following story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and settings are entirely imagined and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or real-life events is purely coincidental. This story is intended to inspire, educate, and motivate through narrative. It serves as a platform for sharing moral lessons, sparking reflection, and encouraging meaningful conversations. Viewer discretion is advised for those seeking purely factual or documentary-style content. Thank you for watching and engaging with stories that aim to uplift and empower. Thank you for watching and listening to the sharpest voice in the room. We hope Zora's story moved you, challenged you, and maybe even reminded you of the quiet strength within yourself, or someone you know. If this story spoke to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives that inspire, teach, and stay with you long after they end. Your voice matters here, so drop a comment below and let us know what part of the story resonated most. We read every message and we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're looking for more stories like this, ones filled with heart, depth, and purpose, check out the other videos on this channel. There's more waiting for you. Until next time, keep listening for the voices that rise, quietly, powerfully, and undeniably.